Okay, you're looking at Edith, a Hull House girl who became Sister Serial, BVM, and taught for 38 years at St. Mary High School in the neighborhood just around the corner from Hull House. This is part of the exhibit, so you can see it and read more about it, about her and how this wonderful connection was made. Jane Addams' dilemma. I had such a wonderful time last evening listening to Professor John McReevy give an amazing talk. It was rich. It was humorous. It was comprehensive, and it was American history, I think, at its best, in the direction that we're going in, that this conference really is identifying for all of us, that we're at the epicenter of what I hope, I'm being optimistic, of a turn in how we view American history. And Catholicism, such an important component of our nation, is becoming part of the American narrative in ways that we, all of us here who have been working in the field, have been pushing for a very long time. And so for those who were here, he did mention Thomas Jefferson and John Addams. Addams with a D, one D. And now we're crossing over and we're going to look at Addams with a double D. I will say that they were separated by about a century, and yet they shared something in common. They were very anxious about Catholic Jesuit priests and Catholic schools. Okay, and I'm going to start by noting the wonderful address that historian Carol Coburn gave on Thursday evening, which deepened our understanding of the crucial role Catholic sisters have played in building and shaping Catholic culture and American life over the last 200 years. You don't have to look far for examples. Right around the corner at the Loyola Museum of Art in the Crossings and Dwellings exhibit is visual evidence of the contribution of the Religious of the Sacred Heart and the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, BVMs, to the social infrastructure of Chicago, and to the development of an American Catholic middle class. And this is not in any way in the tone of triumphalism. And we had some interesting historiographic discussion yesterday. This is in the tone of social realism, historical veracity, reality, historical context. This happened. Okay, I have to get that off my chest. All right. They were involved in the social infrastructure of Chicago, and as I said, the development of the American Catholic middle class, and that's important. It's important for working class labor history studies. It speaks to the issue of false consciousness and why the labor historians are just don't know how to deal with Catholics. They're beginning to. This is important. Anyway, many of the BVMs were immigrants themselves or the daughters of immigrants, and they understood that Catholic schools could play a central role in shaping American democratic life. Their schools gained a reputation for excellence and grew steadily, enrolling more than 5,000 students in Chicago by the time of the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. At the turn of the 20th century, BVMs were the vanguard among American Catholic educators in planning high schools and colleges for the great industrial cities where working-class Catholic immigrants had settled. St. Mary High School on Chicago's near west side, followed by the Immaculata on the city's north side, were modern central high schools where Catholic girls from across the metropolitan area were educated for academic, religious, and commercial careers. The BVM vision of a comprehensive educational system for women took physical shape in 1930 with the opening of Mundelein College. Not only did the Art Deco skyscraper reflect a modern sensibility with a curriculum to match, but the commuter college provided opportunities for a new generation of American-born Catholics. In the last 50 years, historians have documented the contributions of American women to the social, cultural, political, and economic life of the nation in the transformative years of nation building at the turn of the 20th century. We now know that a robust women's political culture existed decades before women won the vote, and there is extensive scholarship describing and critiquing the contributions of women to the formation of the modern welfare state. Jane Addams is one of the well-studied women in this great narrative of American women's social history. And while progress has been made, historians of gender and women's history continue to grapple with the problem of integrating gender and women's history into the master narrative. To complicate our work, I want to introduce the problem of where American women's Catholic history fits into American women's history, and implicitly where it fits into the national narrative, a narrative that has been dominated for the past 200 years or more by the Protestant worldview and has been told largely through Protestant male voices. This morning, I am using Jane Addams because she is really a kind and noble woman who tried her very best. Okay, I want to get the best case, not the worst case. Okay, so I'm this morning using Jane Addams and her relationship to Catholics to examine this historiographic problem. Addams was a self-proclaimed small d democratic cosmopolitan who regarded her whole house settlement as a positive force to uplift her immigrant neighbors. But, like many middle-class Protestants, she regarded their neighborhood as a slum, okay? Devoid of the leadership necessary to form a higher life for the men, women, children, the families that lived there. In London, she had seen the social settlement movement at its very beginnings. And it was a recent effort by an Anglican priest and his wife and a group of Oxford University graduates to overcome the widening gap between the people who ran English society and the masses who lived and worked separated from culture and privilege. Addams regarded Toynbee Hall, the settlement house in East London, and her own work as an outgrowth of a humanitarian impulse in a new generation of educated Protestants who found the traditional approaches of their denominational churches inadequate to the problems of industrial life. It was a kind of missionary endeavor of a new, quote, non-sectarian, unquote, approach. Addams understood that the English model didn't fit the needs and conditions of American cities, and one of the most obvious differences was that in Chicago, where she and Ellen Gates Starr settled in 1889, the population was overwhelmingly immigrant and Catholic. My revisionist work on Jane Addams and Hull House has led me to reconsider the contribution of Catholic sisters and to question why Hull House continues to be regarded as the norm against which Catholic institutions are compared. Neither Addams nor historians writing about her acknowledge that Catholic parishes and schools functioned as social centers that performed many of the same functions as the settlement. I often ask myself, because Addams had lots of Madonnas in Hull House. She had figurines, and one of the first things she offered to Graham Taylor, the Congregationalist minister who was opening up Chicago Commons, was a painting of a Madonna. Okay, so why was that Madonna differently seen than the Madonna in the church around the corner? Okay, it's one of the things that I've thought about a lot. Okay, on the whole, Addams scholars have not been terribly concerned that she interpreted urban problems without any reference to the parish system and the work of Catholic sisters teaching in the Whole House neighborhood. Far from critiquing Addams' basic sociological views on the subject of Catholic immigrants and their adjustment to American life, the opposite has occurred. The trend in Addams' scholarship has been to argue for her inclusion as a major American sociologist and as a pragmatic philosopher of democracy. On the other hand, there has been a new effort to understand the historiographic problem of the Protestant bias in the writing of American history, to which I applaud. Until we are able to decenter the implicit Protestant hegemonic view of American history, we will continue to have problems integrating new knowledge of Catholics in American history. And more pointedly, we will continue to write the narrative of Addams and Whole House without acknowledging the dilemma she had in her work with Catholics. I don't know if dilemma is entirely the right word. You know, you have to make these titles early on. I don't know, paradox, contradiction, whatever. We must carefully distinguish Addams' positive attitudes toward immigrants and her sympathetic concern for their rights and welfare from her attitudes about the serious issue of religious pluralism in democracy. Simply put, Addams loved the people, but disliked and distrusted their churches, their priests, their schools, and the sister teachers who ran them. When we study her evaluation of immigrants, we have to understand this dimension of her deeply rooted worldview. The paradox of Addams' thinking about her immigrant neighbors is most apparent in her agenda for the educational needs of foreign-born children and the children born in the United States of immigrant parents. For Addams and other social feminists and progressive reformers, the public schools were the only sure route to a harmonious and effective democracy. Immigrants and their children could be good citizens if they didn't go to parochial schools. More than this, Addams and her colleagues called for reform of the public schools to address the special needs of their immigrant children. The Roman Catholic teaching sisters, the BVMs, and the Jesuits who taught young men at St. Ignatius College, just a few blocks from Whole House, believed they could establish a system of Catholic schools that would promote a wholesome Americanism as well as traditional Catholic religious values. They intended for their graduates to enrich the national civic life, not imperil it. They also had definite ideas about the kind of instruction and curriculum their students required. The Whole House settlement and the Holy Family parish schools competed for control of the education of the neighborhood children. It was a political battle that was waged in the city council, on the school board of the Chicago Public Schools, at the state level where compulsory education legislation was debated, and on the ground in the competition in the neighborhoods for students. It was self-conscious on both sides. Jesuit priests begged the BVMs to open their schools in August before the public schools. There was a rush to keep up with the Catholic student population and make certain no families were kept from placing their children in parochial schools. Public school policy was shaped in the context of this battle royal. Catholics as a beleaguered minority shaped their American church identity and their individual identities in the heat of the discourse over the schools. The debate over the role of the state in the education of children in a democracy that has many cultures, races, and ethnicities attending a variety of school systems was important at the turn of the 20th century and continues to be important in the 21st. If we have time in the question and answer section this morning, it might be interesting to think about how inner city Catholic schools are viewed in our present educational crisis and how they were viewed about 120 years ago. Today and yesterday, the relationship of education to citizenship and to the stability and success of the economy and the social system elevates debates about pedagogy, social control, and curricular choices to the highest levels of social policy. In the 19th and 20th centuries, non-Catholics saw the public schools as good schools and the parochial schools as bad schools. This certainly was the attitude of Jane Addams and the reformers in the Whole House Circle. This fits in with Tracy Fessenden's interesting analysis of Protestantism and Catholicism in American culture and literature. Fessenden describes how anti-Catholic Protestants created a myth of good religion and bad religion that they masked with notions of secularism in public life. Good religion is associated with freedom and enlightenment, bad religion with coercion and constraint. And this scheme, Fessenden says, has become implicit in the progress narrative of democracy. Now, Catholics also had ideas about good and bad religion. This was the whole point about avoiding the public schools, which Catholics continued to believe were really a cover for Protestantizing efforts. When Whole House was accused by one of the principals at St. Mary High School as not being a Christian institution, this was really a statement about the settlement house's anti-Catholic and implicitly pro-Protestant approach. Most troubling to me as an historian is that Addams fails to give a fair accounting of the religious and educational institutions in the neighborhood after claiming that only through the experience of living in the neighborhood could educated Americans like herself uplift the people in these working class and immigrant districts. By 1892, 12 Catholic schools existed in the Whole House neighborhood. I have found no documentation that she approached these institutions, to which so many of the children and youth who participated in the settlement house were enrolled, with any openness or interest even in their teachers, in their little programs, and so forth that were going on. And she did this even as she pledged herself to engage with the common lot of people. Now, Ellen Gates Starr was different, and that's for another lecture. I'm looking at Sue Ellen Hoy and thinking about her great little book about the last part of Ellen's life. But there's something very different about their approaches, and it was out of the experiences, I think, that the two had and how they sorted these out that you can get a real understanding of the complexity of this issue of how to deal with Catholicism. Anyway, where am I here? Okay, the families in her neighborhood, in Addams' neighborhood, including many who sent their children to Whole House programs after school and in the summer, also enrolled their sons and daughters in the Catholic school system. Addams knew these children and could see their talents and their maturation, even with the influence of the religious sisters and the priests. And the teaching sisters were well aware of the influence of Whole House. The children knew there was a conflict. Francine Tarsitano, a 1954 graduate of St. Mary High School, identified this tension when she recounted the disapproval of her that her BVM teachers expressed when she came to school wearing a special Whole House club jacket. They had a little club called the Debs, and they all got these jackets, okay? So this is what the transcript from Franny's interview that I did with her. Well, we were called into the principal's office about these jackets. Where is this club? What is this club? And they answered, this is a Whole House club. We were so proud to say that it was from Whole House. She said, this is the principal, you cannot wear these jackets here, and we advise you not to go to Whole House anymore because it is not a Christian organization. So I went home and I told my mother and father that, and they said, a Christian organization? We never even thought of it as that. But you know, my father went to St. Mary's and said, they're going to Whole House. She is going to Whole House. They've only done good things for our family. Well, we were never allowed to wear the jackets anymore. That was it. Couldn't wear it to St. Mary's. Okay. For Addams, who affixed a Cairo cross to her bodice, Her work at Hull House was religious. Yet by establishing her settlement as an independent association without ties to any religious organization, university, or other agency, and by not requiring religious worship or religious education, she set out to spread a Christian humanism that she envisioned as cosmopolitan and democratic, inclusive, and tolerant. In this way, she envisioned Hull House as a cathedral of humanity, a place where people of all religious persuasions could learn about each other and engage in a kind of civic or democratic fellowship. Did this mean that she resolved to exclude religious ideas from Hull House? Not really. In a letter to a college settlement colleague, Addams spoke candidly. We find each year that it is more possible to discuss frankly religious problems and differences because our neighbors have constantly less fear that we will proselyte them. That was the word she used in the letter, proselyte. She had Victorian spellings for different things. Anyway, Franny Tarsitano's father, the son of Italian immigrants, was comfortable sending his children to Hull House, where they had, quote, done good things for the family, unquote. The Hull House approach to Catholic schools really begins before Addams located her new experiment in the 19th Ward, otherwise known as Holy Family Parish. She was already convinced that immigrants needed to attend public schools. She was already convinced, she wasn't even there yet, that immigrants needed to attend public schools, and was pleased when her new friend and guide to Italian neighborhoods, Alessandro Mastro Valerio, reported to her that he had, in 3 months' time, quote, sent 500 Italian children to public schools, end of quote. Addams shared Valerio's goal to place as many Italian children in public schools as possible. Now, Valerio was an interesting spokesperson or interpreter for his kind of liminal person between the different communities in the Italian neighborhood we don't have time to really go into him, but he was a nationalist. We are talking about how the Jesuits were anti-nationalist. He was an Italian nationalist, a great fervid supporter of Mazzini, Garibaldi. You would believe that there was such hot and furious criticism and contestation in the neighborhood over whether or not to make a public school be named for Garibaldi. It ended up they chose Dante because they had to reach back into the Middle Ages, to get consensus. So this is going on, but she chooses someone who affiliates with the Giordano Bruno Society, and for those of you who don't know, he was burned at the stake in 1600 by the Pope for his anti-clerical, heretical views. And these Bruno societies were all over the world and were in the United States, and they met at Hull House for a long time. I've traced it between 1908 and 1914. She was constantly debating and dealing with the problem of the Bruno Society being there. But it fit her feeling about what was liberal democracy, what was nationalism, what was the progressive order of things in world history. Okay, so he, like the liberal Protestant social feminists who worked with Addams on school reform, were saving children from the dangers of indoctrination in papal-controlled classrooms. This fear by the hegemonic Protestant culture of Catholic indoctrination and the formation of new citizens was so strong that for the Hull House residents imbued with these ideas, children in the elementary parochial schools could not be counted as properly schooled. This is indicated in the famous Hull House Maps and Papers, published in 1895. Children of immigrants who attended parochial schools, even though they were born in the United States, and most likely were English speakers already, were counted in the nationalities map along with their parents as foreigners. The campaign for more public schools in the 19th Ward was led by the Whole House reformers who claimed that there were 5,000, remember that number, 5,000 children in need of seats in new classrooms and demanded the Board of Education begin construction immediately. This happened to be the exact number of children enrolled in the Catholic elementary schools taught by the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Okay. In the Whole House view, American-born children of immigrants who had not been influenced by the public schools were more truly designated second-generation immigrants than first-generation Americans. And this was an important sociological finding that everybody agreed she knew about. So these had consequences for the way in which policies and ideas about public schools and American citizenship and Americanization, they played out as a result of this knowledge. And Jane Addams became the great interpreter because she lived in the neighborhood to the rest of the Americans. In 1897, in this vein, Jane Addams, addressing the influential National Education Association, the NEA, on the needs of foreign-born children, or the American-born children of immigrants, explained very carefully that their families, these immigrant families, had no, I quote, no social life in any structural form and can supply none to the child. Addams is not making a derogatory comment about immigrants, who she asserts have very strong family values and love their children very much. Rather, she is expressing a sociological concept. For John Dewey, the philosopher of education, and for Chicago educator and superintendent of schools Ella Flagg Young, Addams and others in the progressive education movement, schools had to become social centers to supply the kind of guidance, training, and information that immigrant families were unable to provide. What the Whole House maps demonstrate is the lack of public schools in the 30 or so blocks most distressed. In fact, a larger project of the Whole House education reformers was to develop a decent public school system which did not yet exist, although Addams and others felt justified in their claims of its inherent superiority. When Addams and Starr arrived in the 19th Ward, the public schools had quite a bit of catching up to do. Addams and Starr ultimately choose a location for the settlement house that placed it at the intersection of two Catholic neighborhoods. And I don't know whether they really knew that or not consciously when they did it, okay? To the east of Halsted Street, there were about 30 city blocks of Chicago-style tenements filled with immigrants of many nationalities, but predominantly Roman Catholic and Italian. Here in the River Ward, industrial and commercial businesses had mushroomed after the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, and the housing stock accommodated increasing numbers of immigrant workers' families. To the west, and including Whole House itself, was a more prosperous neighborhood of more seasoned immigrants and of older residents who Addams called old settlers and invited to the settlement house, just as she invited the newcomers. In America for many generations, they had settled originally in the near West Side when they, like Charles J. Hull, himself a real estate developer and evangelical Christian who built his homestead in 1856, had imagined their homes would increase in value. Okay. Relatively undeveloped, before the Civil War, this western edge of urban growth also attracted the Jesuit Arnold J. Damon, who founded the Holy Family Parish 1 year after Mr. Hull, built his house. Addams coveted relationships with the neediest, newest immigrants, the Italians, but the earliest efforts at Hull House could not have gotten off the ground without the cooperation and engagement of the Irish Americans and old settlers who lived west of the settlement house. Addams tended to underestimate the private associational strength of the 19th Ward, as if the development at her settlement had no antecedent or parallel institutions with which to have social intercourse. This was particularly true of the underestimating of the Catholic strength and contribution. Had the Whole House Maps and Papers project, how am I doing? mapped the west side of the 19th Ward, their narrative would have been dramatically different. We are not talking about immense space. Just 4 or 5 blocks south, north, or west of Halsted Street and Hull House would have given the neighborhood a different cast. It would have appeared mixed, and economically, with prosperous sections and brick residences, prosperous shops owned by immigrants, and lots of parochial schools and churches. Even the east side, the area mapped, was not all of one piece. Italian families who lived in this congested slum did not describe it that way. Franny, we're going back to Franny Tarsitano, who told the story of her whole house jacket and the reaction of the BVM principal at St. Mary High School, was the youngest of a very large Italian family. In 1901, her grandfather, Leopoldo Tarsitano, had settled in the east end of the 19th Ward on a block in the densely populated blocks earlier depicted in the Whole House maps. Leopoldo had been in the Italian cavalry before coming to the US with his wife, Rosario, and son, Gabriel. The Tarsitanos lived for several years in a flat, and Leopoldo worked as a grocery cart peddler. But by 1907, the family had saved enough money to buy their own 2-story storefront brick home located just west of Holy Guardian Angel Church, an Italian parish. Tarsitano's children and grandchildren all participated in the cultural and recreational opportunities offered by Hull House, and they were devotees of the summer camp in Waukegan, the Bowen Country Club camp, as it was called, a place where the daughters and sons of immigrants had the taste of life outside the neighborhood. They all attended Holy Guardian Angel Church, the parish schools, and all of Leopoldo's 4 granddaughters attended St. Mary High School. One became a physician after graduating from Mundelein and Loyola University Medical School. 2 became school teachers graduating from Northern Illinois University, and another sister married and had children but did not work outside the home. 2 grandsons attended St. Ignatius Jesuit High School and Our Lady of Pompeii High School, the former attending University of Illinois briefly and ending up in a business career at the managerial level. The latter graduated from Loyola University, did graduate work at DePaul and at the University of Nebraska, and became a political science professor at the College of DuPage. One cannot judge whether or not the successes were mostly the credit of the Whole House connection or the extensive connection with Catholic schools. The more complete genealogy of the family indicates that the trends toward secularization in religion and society can be seen in the family, as well as a lasting ethnic and culturally Catholic identity. There had been some intermarriage with non-Catholics, and geographical mobility outside of the neighborhood, to be sure. There are also lasting remnants of the imprint of both Whole House and the values of the teaching sisters. The St. Mary High School experience was critically important for the Italian girls. They may not have fully understood how unique the experience was for the daughters of the working class and immigrant families in the inner city. St. Mary's had already drawn attention to itself when, by 1915, social feminist Ella Flagg Young, superintendent of Chicago's public schools, voiced her concern that there was a disproportionate number of Catholic high school grads enrolled in the Chicago Normal School. They had done so well on the entrance exams that Young was quoted as accusing the Catholics of running, quote, cramming schools, quote, unquote, to inflate their numbers entering the teachers' college. There was anxiety about having too many Catholics from the Catholic system end up as public school teachers. What with Margaret Haley as the president of the union and other important political gains by Catholics in all aspects of municipal life, things were closing in, you know. There was anxiety about having too many Catholics Okay, the issue had been brewing for some time. As early as 1903, that's like 4 years after St. Mary High School opened, okay? But there were other diocesan high schools all over the city, you know, and in other orders who had high schools, okay? Chicago school boards had openly strategized to limit the numbers of Catholics entering the teaching profession. Superintendent of Schools Young, testifying in 1915 before a state committee investigating the Chicago School Board, quote, proposed a quota system by which the board would assign to each high school, both public and private, a fixed number of places in the normal school. The normal school is the teacher college, okay? The Catholic newspaper, The New World, saw this as one more bigoted effort to limit the number of Catholic teachers in the public schools. Such a proposal and others that followed in subsequent years were not successful, but they had a bearing on the Catholic school culture and the responses made by administrators in the Catholic high schools. This is a crucial part of the Catholic narrative of education that, unfortunately, is often not known in Catholic circles either. What provoked the progressive social feminist was the great progress made by the BVM-run St. Mary High School for Girls. Located a stone's throw from the Hull House, St. Mary High School was inaugurated at the height of the debate over urban education. Both the public school and the Catholic began the 20th century with inadequate secondary institutions. At the turn of the century, when St. Mary's was opened, secondary education remained an option for only a small segment of the population, maybe under 10%, okay? Whether American-born or immigrant, okay. St. Mary High School immediately identified college and careers in education as the major goal for its students, many of whom were the daughters of Irish immigrants who had worked as laundresses, seamstresses, and domestics. The BVM schools already had pioneered commercial programs for boys and girls in the 1890s. So when commercial courses were introduced in 1902, they realistically prepared St. Mary's students for the sector of the economy where jobs for women were expanding rapidly, the commercial office. Courses in bookkeeping, typing, business arithmetic, and soon stenography set the tone and the goal for many graduates of attending a business college even after high school. Now, to compare what was being taught in the new vocational high schools in the public sphere, they were less interested in developing really good executive secretarial skills for a commercial work, and tended to really, they were so invested with the idea they had to train the immigrants and their children in how to be modern, how to live in the city, that they carried on about laundry and sewing and how to stretch a rug, and we have wonderful images of these from the local newspapers, and everybody thought this was just wonderful because the idea they had been told, these people live in the slums, they don't know how to live, they don't know how to do wash, and of course only when we hire them in the back door, and then we were allowing them to do our laundry. But anyway, but that was not a contradiction that people really worried about. So this was really, so even when they introduced non-classically academic program, it was suited to what was really the need. The young women studied laboratory sciences right from the beginning, including physics and chemistry and biological sciences. And they had, of course, music and manual training and so forth. Textbooks were the same that were used in the high schools and the public high schools, which was an interesting finding, I felt. Significantly, St. Mary's was the first Catholic girls' high school to offer advanced academic work in the form of college extension courses taught by the Jesuits. Okay, now we're coming to sort of the end. I'm going to sum up. This is Addams speaking. The object of the social settlement is the uplifting of the people, the word people representing the working classes. And this can best be accomplished by the poor acting as their own missionaries. No doubt the working people could be raised, And she means raised up in a kind of social consciousness sort of way. Okay, they could be raised if they could be made to feel their power as citizens. It's a modern concept, empowerment. Because they are nearer to the needs of the poorest, while those who work in more comfortable parts of the town only hear of their needs remotely and know little practically about them, okay? So she says this is what the object is of the settlement, to raise up people so that they are empowered to be their own missionaries. This statement by Addams, paradoxically, could have been written by the BVMs, simply changing social settlements to Catholic schools. The BVM sister teachers came from immigrant backgrounds. Some were the first women in their families to achieve literacy. They were indeed the poor acting as their own missionaries. The young women who were educated at St. Mary High School included many who came from the 30 or so blocks east of Halsted Street, mapped by the Hull House residents in 1895 and designated as a slum neighborhood. In innumerable cases, neighborhood boys and girls of talent and potential found Hull House to be a school of opportunity and refinement, a bridge out of the neighborhood. In delving into their backgrounds, however, one can draw this surprising conclusion. Many of the best and brightest stars, who, as one of them put it, bit the apple of the settlement ideology about civic engagement, had been educated in the American Catholic parochial system. The Hull House neighbors did not make an either-or choice, but as children and later as young adults, many immigrants and their children and grandchildren found ways to benefit, to negotiate around the differences from religious, family, and social settlement networks in ways that were not imagined by either the social reformers or the Catholic hierarchy. More than most mainline Protestants, Addams challenged her own biases and consciously pursued an openness to her immigrant neighbors. She opposed immigration restriction, upheld the rights of aliens, including their freedom to dissent and criticize the government. She insisted that Hull House not proselytize its Jewish and Roman Catholic neighbors, and she took pride in the Greek plays, the Italian and German social get-togethers, and the exhibits of old world arts and crafts displayed in the Hull House Labor Museum. She handled religious and cultural differences through the performance of religious pageantry without worship, religious art without prayer, and enactments of ethnic plays in the context of ethnically mixed audiences. But the heavy-duty lifting educationally in the neighborhood remained in the hands of Catholic women, the teaching sisters, who recent flight from poverty and illiteracy in their crossings gave their commitment to educate Catholics an urgency and a wisdom as they prepared the poor to be their own missionaries. Thank you.
I get some microphones for questions.
We have some microphones here. Sue Ellen, there's a John's coming around.
Speaking of Elevate Star, and this question is really meant to dig deeper into Jane Addams' attitude on religion. How much emphasis would you place on the cooling of their relationship, Addams and Starr, to religion? Most historians of Jane Addams give a great deal, and some of them attribute religion as the real problem between these two women who were friends and family.
Well, I think it wasn't religion per se. It was the kind of religion that that Starr was leading to, was part of it. This is a complicated thing. Addams had a very close relation. Addams had a very close relationship with Julia Lathrop, and who came from the same part of Illinois, and their fathers had actually been associates in business and things. And Julia Lathrop, who becomes the first head of the Children's Bureau in Washington, D.C. in 1912. So she's a very exceptional, important progressive era person. And she has a relationship with Jane Addams forever. And the Jane Addams, one of the last things she writes, in fact, is a little book called My Friend Julia Lathrop. And what she does is, I think, she identifies more thoroughly with Julia Lathrop, sort of like an alter ego, than she does with either Ellen Starr or even Mary Rose Smith, who comes from a very wealthy family and has a different kind of a personality in life, who is her companion, Addams' companion. But what she says about Julia Lathrop, she's almost saying about herself, or at least this is how I'm reading that text. And she talks about her as being scientific and broad-minded, and even though she comes from the capitalist class, she is able to be empathetic for the working class in a reasonable way. And this is describing Addams in many ways, and that she also was trying to escape the conventional missionary role in Protestantism, in evangelical Protestantism, that women of their class and standing in these seminaries. Julia Lathrop also goes to Rockford Seminary, but she is able to escape and goes to Vassar. But even Vassar at that time was a very Protestantizing institution. But anyway, Julia, she says of Julia that she had two aunts. She had an aunt who became a missionary in China and India. And at a certain point, she comes back with her partner, another woman, and after a long career in India, and visits them in Hull House. And Julia is very afraid of this visit. Oh, she says, I don't want, to have to deal with my aunt who's going to say to me, you didn't do the right thing in life. You didn't live up to this Christian, value system. And what happens is the reverse. It's another time that Jane Addams tells the story that we are a modern kind of new kind of sort of missionary. And she tells it in this way. The aunt comes and says, after a couple of years, a couple of days, living at Hull House as a guest, she says, my goodness, she says, Julia, Jane, you're living like missionaries. Okay, so I don't think it's necessarily the religion, it's the approach that Starr takes to religious certainty, to a kind of a theological disposition, and so forth. The real issue is, and I think people haven't made enough of this from the early years, Ellen Starr was a very picky, strict critic of Jane Addams. She thought Jane Addams was too much in herself, that she had lost some of the early idealism of where she was going, and that the whole social settlement movement was not going in quite the right direction, and she says this at a meeting of the Chicago Settlement Association, and makes it very clear that there are things about pridefulness and about the way they're accommodating a sort of approach to negotiating and getting along with wealthy people on the one hand and dealing in politics and things, which is not the community of kindred fellows, the fellowship of a religiosity and a religious commitment that really Addams said in the beginning she was sort of looking forward to creating, and Ellen really wanted to create and didn't have happen. So I don't know if that helps.
It's working now.
For a quick question,
Okay.
maybe we go over to Paula for a final question. What I really love about your paper is the way in which you bring us in the end to show that the people in the neighborhood, in fact, have an ability to look beyond what Addams and the BBMs can't look give us sort of an early 20th century Italian example, and I'd love to know if you found any of the Irish from the 1870s. I mean, I think part of the challenge is I think this is a very complex spiritual marketplace, right, where you have immigrant groups moving in and out with rapidity, and it'd be curious if there's a different perception between Irish and Italian. But the real question I actually want to ask you is, for all of Addams' innovations, her failure to move beyond the inherited wisdom of an 1840s debate about public school systems, right? Which Fessenden lays out very nicely. Does that surprise you? Does it speak to the extent to which Protestant evangelicals had naturalized that to be a public school is to be a Protestant school? Or is there I mean, what do we do with Addams' inability to question that when she can question some of the other things?
I have to, you know, I'm Jewish and my husband is Jewish, and I'm going to take this perspective from what he said when I first read one version of this paper to him. And we, Jews coming from New York, we really thought that the public schools were the best thing that ever happened. It really suited us and our needs. And that's a very interesting thing to look at that and to look at Catholicism in that context and to compare it. I mean, there's so much rich stuff to do and think about historically and sociologically. And we always thought it was our protector, the public schools. And he couldn't stand what I was saying about Addams, because it's not just that Addams was, that this had become part of the skin and bone, you know, of what the American ethos or the American civil religion or public culture says. It's so strong. And that's why I wanted to discuss. I had, you know, how there's recently been a kind of a turn where we look at the Catholic schools that have remained in the hardest, most difficult inner city neighborhoods, are turning out incredibly creative possibilities for individuals and families, and all of a sudden, because we have begun to give up or at least reevaluate whether or not these public schools ever worked, how did they work, when did they work, who did they work for? All of that, the assumptions, if you read any of the master themes and narratives of public education that we have, and we have a lot of it, it's just this, it's like all men are created equal. I mean, it has that standing in our culture, and so it doesn't surprise me. I mean, in a way, it, what appeals to me about Ellen Gate Starr is that somehow she, because she was going to church with the people and more, and she seemed to have a different kind of, she actually just lived in the place and came and, you know, and I think that Addams, it's very complicated. She becomes a public person. The place becomes an exhibit hall for every reformer and their uncle come and want to see it. It's a demonstration laboratory. And so lots of different, it's a complicated, it's going to be a big book. So this is what, but the point is that what we need to do, it's not so much that I want to judge harshly Addams, because I think she really was a person of her times, and so was Dewey and so on. And believe me, there was very little progressive education that ever filtered into the public schools in Chicago. He left early, and the public schools in Chicago have been a mess for a very long time. As much as the teachers have tried and done incredible work, and there have been victories, but they have, because it is imbricated in a political system that's just, you know, out of control. It reflects that. But the thing is, what I am interested in is that historians, we are the ones that have to know that this is in the narrative. We are the ones that have to, you know, make a cautionary take on the words and the things. We have to step out of the box. We cannot continue to use the same Protestantizing lens to figure out what the full narrative is. Somehow we have to find a way of stepping out of that. And the Catholic nuns forced me, big time, to step out of the box.
So your paper gives the parameters of 1890 to 1925. So my question is, how do you think progressivism changed, especially between 1890 and 1925? It's the biggest area of change for progressives. And how did Hull House adapt and change during that time? Did World War I, for instance, and the impact on German and Italian immigrants change the way Addams regarded these things?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's why there is no really good historically contextualized narrative of, I'm using Hull House as a case study, but as one of the leading progressive institutions, playing it out beyond the early years. We are very fascinated with the early years. Okay, so that's what I've been doing. I've been actually working through 1963 when it actually closes in that neighborhood because the University of Illinois comes. Addams, in 1930, writes The Second 20 Years, and it's a very underused text. It's in a way a much better text for historians because it isn't filled with a lot of the, how do I want to say, the mythology writing, the tropes of a kind of romantic memoir that 20 Years at Hull House is. So, and lots of things have happened, as you have indicated, Kyle. She's had a lot of failures. I mean, I'm beginning to compile a list of the failures. The failures are huge. I mean, and one of the biggest failures is, the loss. She is one of the prime architects of the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, 1912, and she makes practically a pact with the devil. She's at the crossroads, and she says, I'll take this militaristic, racist to Theodore Roosevelt because he's my ticket to get this big agenda that the social reformers have been working on from the 1890s to 1912, and we can get it all in one fell swoop because this federalism, this states' rights stuff, this localism, this, Johnny Powers, Irish politician in the neighborhood, they're killing us. We can't get anything done. Let's do this. So she really gets involved with this, and it doesn't work. She hangs on. She doesn't give up until 1916 after Robert La Follette loses. She does vote for Woodrow Wilson, again making a compromise in 1916 because she thinks voting and talking to him will keep him neutral in the war, World War I. She comes back to the neighborhood, and in this second 20 years, she says from 1909 to 1912, I mean, we were really cooking. Things were really going very well, and we cannot recover. We have had a really bad thing happen in our neighborhood, this war and the violence. And she begins to notice racial and ethnic tensions that she had thought of as being minor details that were being worked out in the democracy when she writes Newer Ideals of Peace in 1907. This is the failure of the progressive agenda is very, very serious. These women hang on. Up through the 1930s, they are in it. Mary McDowell, Lillian Wald, Florence Kelly, until they die off, each one. They are in it. They are saving the Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Mothers Act that the American Medical Association wants to destroy, which is one of the only times we had a public health that was trying to do work with pregnant women and their children afterwards and neonatal care. That was many people say one of the greatest achievements of the progressive era, and things like that. They're trying to save things, and they're still working on it, and they get into the New Deal, and Addams becomes very involved in the public housing and so forth. But the problem is that the neighborhood and the project of having this cosmopolitanism and this empowerment of people in a political way never happens, and it hasn't happened yet. So I don't know, you know, I mean, 1925 is not really, it's a number. This is a complicated thing, and individual reformers live out their hopes and keep working. In that way, Addams and that generation, my most favorite picture, and I'll end with this, is of Mary McDowell and Jane Addams, and it's 1932, and they're bringing a whole bunch of anti-war petitions to the Democratic National Convention that's meeting in Chicago. And there's a big torchlight parade, and they've got, and you know, the drums of war in Europe are really, really starting. Even in 32, it's a bad time. And it's the Depression. And they've got this sign, peace. Okay, now everybody thinks it's been misdated as 1917 for some reason. People think it's about World War I. If you look at their bodies, if you look at their faces, if you look at their legs, they're both suffering from heart disease, from, you know, kidneys aren't working that well, and they've got on these heavy, you know, stockings, you know, to help your veins and everything, and they're together, and they love each other, and they're devoted, and they're still at it. And in this respect, they truly are like the BVM congregation and the other sisters on the bus.